Um, Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you.
So I think we can start. Tonight's presentation is entitled Damage Assessment, SARAID Case Studies, including Albania and Beirut. We're very lucky this evening to have three speakers sharing their experience from the field in post-disaster damage assessment. Joshua Makabuag is acting chair of the ISRAC-T Earthquake Engineering Field Investigation Team. He has a background in building design with a number of UK consultancies, a PhD in building damage predictions for tsunami, and now consults in catastrophe risk modeling to the World Bank and the reinsurance sector. He's also an urban search and rescue engineer with the UK team SARAID. He will provide an introduction to SARAID and engineering within the context of the urban search and rescue environment. He'll share some key experience through case studies and describe the Damage Assessment Coordination Center established in Albania. Together after him, we have Mark Scorer, who is a committee member of the Society of Earthquake and Civil Engineering Dynamics, SECED. He has a background in earthquake engineering seismologies, and geotechnics, and works as a chief engineer for Athens. Similarly to Josh, Mark is member of the UK charity Search and Rescue Assistance in Disaster, SARAID, specializing as an urban search and rescue engineer, and also performing the role of International Development Officer and Engineering Training Officer. In his presentation, Mark will discuss his experience from leading the SARAID deployment on the ground in Albania before introducing the establishment of the Damage Assessment Coordination Center and Specialist Support Network for the recent deployment to Beirut. Last but not least, we have Suzie Cooper, who is structural engineer at Elliott Wood. She has a background in building design, working on projects in a variety of sectors across London. Suzie is also an urban search and rescue engineer for SARAID. She has been deployed to Albania and more recently Beirut, where she was part of the team who set up the Damage Assessment Coordination Center and also provided advice to the Lebanese authorities on their assessment procedures. Suzie will conclude the presentation with her experience on the ground in the immediate aftermath of the Beirut explosion and the good work she was done to provide future support. So without further ado, I leave the floor to Josh.
Hello, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
All right, perfect. Okay, so my name is Joshua Makabuag, as Valentina just said. We have a lot of ground to cover, so I'm just going to dive straight in. Overall, there are three speakers today, and we'll be giving damage assessment examples covering earthquake, windstorm, and blast from a number of different countries and events. But in case you get lost in the whirlwind of slides and examples, then just remember these three key messages and aims from this presentation. So the first aim is that I'd like to introduce to you SARAID, that's Search and Rescue Assistance in Disasters, which is a UK charity made up entirely of volunteers and funded entirely by donations. And if you are interested in joining, contributing, or collaborating, then please get in touch after the presentation. The second aim of the presentation is to show how the learning from various damage assessment experiences have all come together to form what has later been called the Damage Assessment Coordination Center. Now, this is something that's not codified in international an international SOP. And so we want to show you our view of the key components that we think make up a strong damage assessment coordination system and give examples of its implementation. And the third aim is really to focus on the most recent, and I think for many people therefore the most interesting example, which is the Beirut deployment. So those are the three things that we'll be going over. So try and keep that in mind as you go over all of these slides. The three speakers are myself, Mark Scorer, and Suzie Cooper, and we are all engineers with SARAID. There you go. So just to make sure that we're all on the same page, then I should explain urban search and rescue. So you'll see USAR fairly regularly throughout the presentation. That's urban search and rescue. And that is finding and extricating people trapped in collapsed buildings. And in the case of SARAID, that's generally overseas events, overseas earthquakes or other disasters. That involves a number of things, such as actually finding the casualties. Where are these people? Which buildings are they in? Where are they in the buildings? Are they alive? Where in the buildings? Shoring and stabilizing that structure to prevent or slow further collapse. Lifting and shifting of heavy items in order to get to the casualty, moving slabs and debris. Breaching and breaking what can't be lifted, so cutting through floors, walls, etc., again to get to that casualty. A lot of that involves working at height or on unstable ground, which of course involves rope work. And then when finding the casualty, it likely involves basic first aid in order to stabilize the casualty in order to get them out of the building to more dedicated medical help. So that's the whirlwind overview of search and rescue, but one part of that and one part of the SARAID team is the engineers within the team. And I'll just read what's on the page, which is that our role as engineers is to assess these damaged structures and advise on the least dangerous way to reach and extricate those victims. So as a quick example, if you look at the bottom left image on the screen, so this is actually from the Nepal earthquake, a collapsed building where we were told that someone was likely inside the building at the time of collapse. And if you see it, I don't know if you probably can't see my mouse, but there's a doorway in that image. And if you were to step in that doorway and look left, you'd see the middle image, which is of a bowing door with a nice neat crack through the lintel above. And that door is obviously below the collapsed floors and slabs above. So there's a good chance that that door is actually supporting some of the weight of the structure above, and that the door may be acting structurally. So that would mean that if it was necessary to go further into the structure, then the least dangerous way probably doesn't involve kicking that door down, or at least it would involve attempting to stabilize the structure before proceeding. To give further examples from the Nepal earthquake. So the Nepal earthquake occurred in 2015. It was a magnitude 7.8 to the north. The original shock was to the northwest of the capital city of Kathmandu. It resulted in over 8,500 casualties. Teams from around the world responded, all the way from the UK, many countries across the EU, India, China, the US, and many more. And SARAID was among those teams, and we deployed to Nepal, and we conducted search and rescue for 4 days alongside a German light team called At Fire. Now, this event was a huge international effort, and the numbers that I have indicate almost 2,000 rescuers in country to conduct USAR, which is a fantastic response from the global USAR community. And rescues were made, and the teams went home. And that beggars the question, then what? So if you look at these numbers on the left-hand side, I've highlighted some of the ones that I think are most relevant to the following slides. For every death, for every one of those 8,617 casualties, there are around 325 people displaced from their homes and businesses. When we were in country, we saw a large number of people sleeping rough because they were unsure whether or not it was safe to return to their homes. We also saw a large number of people, very large number of people, in unsafe buildings. Now, that image of the disaster management cycle in the center is there to remind us that after that initial response, then begins the long and multi-stage process of trying to get people back into their homes, back into their businesses, and back to their lives. And that leads to a number of actions, and one of those is the image on the right-hand side, which is shoring of a structure in Kathmandu. And I took this photo and I took many other photos like it. And we don't have time to go into the details, but just consider that if there was an aftershock, if there was another large earthquake, which there actually was, or there were a number of aftershocks, and there was actually a very large aftershock that happened not too long after the main shock, that this shoring on this type of building may not be the most effective. And also cast your mind back to what I said on the previous slide, that there were nearly 2,000 rescuers who are in the country, and I assure you that every one of those rescuers is actually very good at shoring, and they train in shoring very regularly, and that just really highlights the need and the opportunity to capture the expertise and the resources from the international rescue community that is in country, that has travelled around the world to respond to this disaster. One such response that can be done in the so-called beyond the rubble phase, so after the search and rescue, or one response that can be done by engineers, and it's one of several, is damage assessments. And in Nepal, then there was a request from the government, which filtered down to the Nepal Engineering College, which filtered down to the USAR coordination cell, which coordinates the search and rescue teams in country. And that request was for engineers to assist with damage assessment. And so SARAID were among a number of teams, including THW from Germany, MSB from Sweden, guys from the UAE, a number of teams who actually committed engineers to that request to assist with damage assessment. Alongside those teams, you also had something called the EU Civil Protection Mechanism, which also had engineers on their team who also committed those people to assist with these damage assessments. Now, my impression of the damage assessments here was that there was a huge need for damage assessment, a huge number of damaged buildings that people were still inhabiting or wanted to know if they could inhabit. But the coordination and the response to that damage assessment need was perhaps a little bit limited. The majority of the assessors, the Nepalese assessors that responded to this particular call through the Nepal Engineering College were students. They were pretty much exclusively engineering students. The taskings were not necessarily clearly prioritized, and they seemed a little bit random. There was no prioritization of hospitals, schools, and critical infrastructure. It took a long time to receive those taskings. So taskings are basically the instructions of where we would be asked to assess, and it would often take until midday or beyond of waiting at the Nepal Engineering College with these other volunteer students before we actually had clear instructions on where we were needed that day. And also the assessment method and the method of data collection was also not clearly defined by the Nepal Engineering College. And it was, in fact, the engineer from the EU Civil Protection Mechanism, someone called Agostino Goretti, very good engineer, who proposed that the entire assessment can be conducted using the UNDP guidance in that image on the right-hand side. And that guidance is basically based on ATC-20 with updates and information relevant to Nepal. So that was a very positive impact of an international engineer. And there are a number of positive impacts from the damage assessments. The image on the top left is a building I remember where I had to ask the inhabitants of the building, around 3 or 4 families, to vacate immediately because the building was clearly unsafe and couldn't be made safe. It was very unclear if it was my jurisdiction to do that, or it probably wasn't. But at the same time, it was also unclear whether or not the assessment results from my assessment were then acted upon in a rapid way that might if they weren't acted upon quickly, might leave these people in serious danger. The image on the bottom left is another impact whereby the patients of a hospital were sleeping outside. And with the assessments of myself and colleagues from the Swedish team, MSB, then we were able to assure the patients that the building was actually safe. A lot of the damage was non-structural, with certain limitations in certain areas where certain parts of the hospital couldn't be used. So as we were leaving, those patients were leaving the lawn to go back into the hospital. And so, there are a number of positive impacts from our assessments and from the wider assessments. But I couldn't help but feel that the impact on the 2.8 million people that were displaced in the event was somewhat limited, or it could have been greater. And the main areas of lack or want or future improvement was in the coordination of the assessors, the procedures of how to conduct those assessments and how to enforce those assessments, and how to inform the building inhabitants of the findings of those assessments, the actual method of the damage assessment as well, and also the method of data collection. These are the 4 things that I felt, okay, these are the real learning points that need to be improved upon so that we can have a bigger impact next time. Fast forward to 2016, you have a magnitude 7.8 earthquake occurring in Ecuador. There were a number of responses, including from the UK government, a UK government team of assessors, of which Mark, the next speaker, was a part. The EU Civil Protection Mechanism, again, was responding. That image on the bottom is of the engineer I mentioned previously, Agostino, and a colleague, Carlos Molina Hart. And the EU team's role related to damage assessment was to they had a number of roles, but many of the things that they did was to essentially support the damage assessment coordination of the Ecuador authorities. And this was a very different event to Nepal. This was a very different organisation structure and government of Nepal. And what was interesting was that much of the work of the EU team and many of the learning points from this disaster were very familiar from what we'd seen in Nepal, and that was that the EU team was able to bring improvements to the assessment processes and the procedures that were put in place around demolition recommendations, around clearing of roads, etc., and the team was also able to support the coordination of the assessors and the collection of and analysis of data. Again, those same lessons as from Nepal. Hurricane Irma was in 2017, in which a number of damaging hurricanes passed through the Caribbean, and I was stationed through SARAID with colleagues from Rescue Global on Turks and Caicos Islands, which is a British protectorate in the kind of northern belt of the Caribbean. For this event, then it was a new peril. It was a new disaster. It was windstorm with elements of wind-driven rain, localized flooding, storm surge, etc. The damage was different. The buildings were different. The logistical challenges were different. But again, those same lessons still came to the fore. That the most important things to do to maximize the impact of the damage assessments was the efficient coordination of the assessors and the overall assessment process, the procedures that are in place for actually enforcing those assessments and for conducting various stages of assessment, the procedure for the actual assessment of buildings themselves, and the management and the collection of data. And that really highlighted that those lessons were not peril specific. And so fast forward again to the Albania earthquake. Albania earthquakes of last year, there were 2, one in September, one in November. The one in November particularly was a very large event in Albania. And the EU Civil Protection Mechanism team, or the EU Civil Protection Mechanism, deployed a team of experts to both of these events. And my role on both of those missions was as the structural engineer to, at first in September, assess the damage assessment coordination system that we saw in place in the country, and in November to actually assist and facilitate that damage assessment coordination for what was a much larger event. So that event, as I say, it was very large in consideration to what's happened before in Albania, and there were 51 casualties, 17,000 people displaced, 10 international USAR teams in the country. And our general role was, as I say, supporting the government of Albania and facilitating the incoming assistance and facilitating the coordination of the response. But my focus was on the damage assessments. And what came to the fore was that, again, there were a number of very familiar lessons. So in September, the first event in Albania, we were lucky to have a little bit more time to see, to be able to observe what was being done and make recommendations. And what we saw was there were different procedures for assessment in different locations. So different engineers were conducting their assessments in different ways and were recording data in different ways. The procedures that were in place, or rather the forms that were handed to the different engineers, did not have methods or instructions, which meant that it was up to the engineer to interpret what they felt was light, moderate, and heavy damage. So again, same engineer looking at the same building could easily come to different conclusions on this. And the result of that is that it's difficult to achieve consistent decision making, which is important when you're talking about life safety and telling people if they need to leave their homes. It's difficult to identify priorities and budget at a national level when the data can't be aggregated because it's all on a different basis. And the request for international assistance is very much hampered when the underlying data that forms the basis of that request is flawed. And there were a number of other fairly common problems with the assessments. And this is just a kind of brain dump of some of those. But rather than getting bogged down into this, and you're welcome to read them when you see the slides or download the slides later, but really just focus on those same 4 components of damage assessment. And that is that the lessons were the same, that all of these components had to be in place, and that was the efficient coordination of assessors, an effective legal and procedural framework to conduct those assessments, a consistent and well-documented method for technical building assessment, and the efficient management and collection and analysis of the data. And so the EU's response, our response to the November event, was to set up what we then called the Damage Assessment Coordination Centre, or the DAC, and you'll see that acronym throughout the presentation now. And the DAC is an international body, it's an international structure that sits alongside the host nation structure of damage assessment coordination. And the DAC's objectives are twofold, and that is primarily to support the host nation, to support the government of Albania to set up and maintain their own system of damage assessment coordination, incorporating those 4 key components on the previous slide. And the second objective is to coordinate the international engineers and efforts that are in country, again, capturing the knowledge of those initially USAR teams that were in country doing the rescues. And then when it was apparent that this system was very effective, there was a further request for engineers, and we ended up having 185 engineers from 18 different countries that were coordinated to work alongside the Albanian assessors, achieving the overall assessment achieved nearly 40,000 assessments, which impacts every one of those 17,000 people that were displaced in this event. So that's where I'll leave it and hand it over to Mark to talk about what his experience was actually on the ground conducting these assessments in Albania.
Thanks, Josh. As Josh mentioned, this was a long time coming, this event, and there's been a lot of planning through various different disasters, and it was refreshing and good to see the change from Nepal, from being on the ground in Ecuador to then leading a small team in Albania, that some of the progress that the international community has made and some of the improvements and how different it was. So this assistance this time again always has to be requested by the host country. You cannot deploy without the request from the host country. Vitally important in everything that we do. It was clear that USAR operations in Albania had come to an end. No further assistance was required there. But the EU Emergency Response Coordination Centre had received a request for teams of structural engineers to be self-sufficient, and with further coordination through the UK Cabinet Office, SARAID deployed a team of 4 engineers that I led, shown there, some fantastic engineers, Suzie, who you'll hear later, Philip Kirazov and Giles Whaley, to Albania for a number of days to conduct damage assessments. It was nice to be part of the actual damage assessment coordination centre because we could turn up on the ground. We had a physical location to visit. This case, it was in the town hall in Durrës. When we attended there, we were given clear instructions. It was being well coordinated by the EU and the UN, all the good work that Josh and the team had put in place. It meant we were assigned areas to go to in the different administrative sectors. We were assigned local engineers and assessors that we'd be working with. They had a clear layout of forms, as Josh mentioned, a clear procedural framework that could be well documented and was consistent. We were there to assist them. As always, it was their responsibility and their decisions that they were making. We were there simply to offer technical guidance, share our knowledge, sometimes provide local reassurance. But it was a definite team effort, and it was a significant change to the previous disasters that we had responded to. In terms of the damage assessments, which was one of the key features and the key piece of information that was being recorded on these forms, it took its basis from the EMS 98 damage scale, as you can see here on the screen, ranging from a DS1 up to the worst case of a DS5. And that was really one of the key take-homes from the information that was being collected and stored in their systems, and this would help advise and guide the need for further, more detailed assessments at a later date. This was still in the phase of relatively rapid assessments being done by the international community, assisting the local engineers. But this would highlight any structures that needed subsequent, more detailed structural assessments that could be done at a later date. Some of the examples of the damage observations, you can see significant infill damage. There was some concrete crushing in columns, a number of movement joints, some performed well, some not so well. Some settlement damage, flooding of some basements generated by the movement of groundwater and cracks in structures. But this was the typical damage that we saw on the ground. You can see there a small image in the top left. That was the coastal city of Durrës with the point markers on there for all the facilities and the structures that we visited and assessed during our time. We collected all this data. We were given our taskings by email every day very efficiently, and we submitted our results at the end of each day back in with our damage state levels in parallel with the local assessors who had the forms, and they would sign off on these forms and then submit them back in, and they would be digitized and they would go into the main database to be used for the remediation and the rebuilding effort in the future. As you can see, the majority of the structures that we assessed, nearly 40% there, were DS1 with really no structural damage. However, there were a few that did reach sort of possibly nearly 20% that were from DS3 to DS5, which involved certain structural damage and would either require a further assessment or would certainly require remedial measures to make them safe again. The main conclusions from our time there I'll start at the bottom with a good one, actually, was that it was good to see that when the buildings were designed or had been designed to the Albanian code and the quality of construction was as it should be, then generally the buildings did perform well and as they should have done. However, there were issues. The majority of the collapses were due to lack of control and regulations, poor quality construction. These are the same things we often see in every disaster, particularly with infill walls and connections there, which provide a life safety hazard falling on people below. One of the sad things to see in this event was an article that came out shortly after, was that there were a significant number of arrests made on suspicion of murder and abuse of power due to the collapse of buildings. Two were hotel owners in the port area. The hotels had been built illegally, unfortunately without planning permission, and very poor construction techniques, and subsequently lives were lost because of this. But in every sad note on all these deployments, there's always hope and some amazing stories of resilience and survival, just as you'll probably all have seen the 2-year-old girl that's just been rescued in Turkey after some 91 hours buried. Then we got the opportunity to meet the factory owner in blue in the middle of the left-hand image there. He was in what's left of the structure on the right. It was a 4-story structure at the time of the event. His wife and child were in the top floor. You can see it's now resting on the roof of a truck. They luckily escaped relatively unharmed. He, however, was on the 3rd floor, which is pancaked, as you can see now, but miraculously was pulled to safety by his workers and escaped with little more than a few bruises and scratches. And he told us this story there on site and was fairly emotional about it, but it was a miraculous account of any wrong position, and that could have been the end for him. But there's always hope, which is why SARAID as an organisation still deploys and still places a massive amount of importance on doing everything we can to help those in need. Moving on to Beirut and August time. This, in effect, was a relatively unheard of, almost extreme event for deployment for USAR. It also happened to occur as a multi-hazard response due to the pandemic. So there are numerous complications with this event that came into the mix. I'm sure you'll all have seen the video footage of the devastating explosion, which is hard to believe, but there's an image there of the almost mushroom cloud with the colouring from the ammonium nitrate that exploded on the right. It happened on the 4th of August, just after 6 p.m. local time. There was an initial explosion. The warehouse roof caught fire, and there were some flashes from fireworks, it's believed, that went off. And then some 30 seconds later, more than 2,500 tons of ammonium nitrate exploded with devastating consequences, killing more than 180 people, injuring well over 6,000. And again, coming back to that drastically increased number, as Josh mentioned, 300,000 people displaced from their homes. The government of Lebanon requested USAR assistance immediately, and a number of teams were deployed. Additional requests through charities Operation Florian, Save the Children, and through the British Embassy in Beirut led to SARAID's deployment, and they responded within the first 48 hours. Suzie, after myself, is going to talk a bit more in detail about the physical team that deployed and her experiences of on the ground. And I'm going to touch now on a bit more on the deployment support team, which was led by Josh and I from the UK, and in particular the engineering support team, and what is a relatively new concept for SARAID, but one which we're developing. And if anybody is interested in getting involved, as Josh mentioned, please do get in touch, is what we're referring to as a specialist support network. And I'll give you a little bit more information on that. So the focus of the engineering support team in the UK, of which SARAID is lucky enough to have several other fantastic engineers. I mentioned a couple of them before, in Philippe and Giles. More to mention is Jenny Jury, Alex. There's a number of staff back here in the UK that worked around the clock after their day jobs, came home, and they were poring over technical documents to help us put together the DAC proposal that Josh has mentioned earlier, that was done for Albania. And the lessons learned there were really useful in implementing a DAC here in Beirut. The need was the same, identified as the effective coordination of Lebanese and international assessment teams. Meetings were held with the governor of Beirut and the chief engineer there, and at their request, SARAID sought to establish a DAC, again in a physical location in the centre of Beirut, to help coordinate the teams and implement the 4 components that again Josh highlighted earlier. Those being the coordination of assessors, the procedural and legal framework that those assessors would work within, the technical building assessment to ensure that there was a consistency to all this data collection, and then the data management, again, to ensure that all the information that was collected or the data that was collected could be turned into useful information, stored correctly, and be of benefit to the host country for their implementation of remediation in the future. So Suzie is going to talk more in detail about the implementation of the coordination and of the data management. You can see there the sectorization that's done on the map in the top left. This is in accordance with administrative boundaries, subtly different to sometimes the USAR operations where the city gets sectorized, sometimes by USAR teams if it hasn't already been done by the host country, and these can typically follow road boundaries, rivers. However, the importance for structural assessments is that they have an administrative boundaries and they work within there. The procedural and legal framework, which I'm going to touch on next, is important to ensure that there is an official system of working and who does what in this situation. In terms of who has the responsibility and the power to do such, in terms of delegating buildings as being unsafe or restricted for use, this has to come from those in country as the local government or the local authority in charge of the situation. This is not the responsibility or the place for the international teams to impose that on the system, and so it has to be understood. A lot of the time there's a good assessment procedure in place by the host nation, as was the case in Beirut, and sometimes for consistency, just a little few recommendations or advice from the international experience can be all that's required to supplement it. We're not there to take over, we are there simply to support and help the host nation establish a good procedure within a legal framework that buildings can be assessed. In this case, the ultimate objective was habitable, or whether the building had to be evacuated, and then whether placards which would be applied onto the building, once the assessors have made their designation, the police or the army or the official body would then be able to allocate or designate these buildings, tag them as such. The next step was the technical building assessment, as I mentioned, a consistent method to decide and to designate what is happening for each structure. You can see the example of the Beirut assessment form, which was already in place and was widely used. All that SARAID did, with the help of the engineers in the UK and the help of some of the international standards, in this case ATC 20 and ATC 45 for wind loading as well, we provided some useful additional guidance. We had discussions and meetings with the local engineers in Beirut to provide any advice to help make a consistent methodology that could be utilized and was of benefit to them and their work going forward, to ensure that each assessor could come back with a consistent response to the questions of the form. Suzie again is going to talk about some of the particular cases of how it was implemented on the ground and hopefully the success of it. and now I'll hand over to her, who can talk in a bit more detail about the boots on the ground in Beirut.
Hi everyone. As introductions have said, I'm Suzie. I was deployed to Beirut with SARAID in August. I'm just first going to touch on the deployment timeline from SARAID's point of view. So on the 4th of August was the devastating explosion. As Mark mentioned, this happened at just past 6 p.m. local time. On the 5th of August, members of SARAID were requested to confirm their availability, and at this point the team were put on standby. As Mark mentioned, this request for assistance had come through the British Embassy in Albania, and we had been specifically recommended due to our skills in structural engineering. Quite late that night, the committee agreed that a team will deploy. And so once that decision is made, a team is decided upon. In this case, it was a mix between engineers, medics, logistical managers, some USAR techs. And then the next step for those team members is really the final stages of packing their own personal kit. But we've also got to organise going to our own stores, which are based in Bristol, where we pick up kind of food rations, comms kit, all those sorts of things. And then at 10 a.m. the next day, so on the 6th of August, the first team was at Heathrow Airport, about to deploy. So later that night, we landed in Beirut at 7:30. So within 48 hours of the blast, SARAID are in country and kind of getting to work. The next day, the 7th of August, is our first day on the ground. So today, that day, we were meeting with the governor of Beirut and the chief engineer of the Beirut municipality, kind of understanding what's needed from us. We also managed to set up a base in the Beirut municipality that we could perform the DAC out of. We were kindly provided with some space and some rooms to do this. And even here in this building, it's a real stark reminder of the impact of the blast, as there's no windows left in the entire building. So you might not entirely be able to see in this picture, but behind us there's window frames, but there's absolutely no glass. It's completely gone. This day we requested assistance from engineers of international USAR teams, which were in country. So that really got the ball rolling on the DAC side. The 8th of August, the second team of SARAID flies out. This included myself, and for me as an engineer, knowing that I'm going into a country and helping them with structural assessments, on the plane I'm kind of reading up about Lebanese structures, about the codes they have in place, and also specifically about blast loading, as that's quite specific for this deployment. For the team in country, this is their second day on the ground, and they are starting to coordinate international engineers who responded to our request and started to send some of these teams out with local engineers. On the 9th of August, so the second team who arrived the previous night, we do a bit of a recce. Again, this included myself, and I think doing a recce and driving around the city was really helpful from an engineer's point of view. I could get a bit of an idea of what sort of structures we'll be looking at across the city. And again, you just notice the damage of this blast. There's glass all over the city. You know, all the windows are gone from all the buildings, and it's quite a stark reminder of the damage that's occurred. We get a team of SARAID engineers out on the ground that day to start doing assessments ourselves and helping those local engineers, also getting an understanding of the assessment process that's there and ways that we could try and tweak and improve it. Then generally going forward over the days, our days generally consisted of coordination of international engineers. We met with authorities to discuss procedures and protocols that needed to be put in place. Towards the end, there was lots of discussions on how they can continue this work once we stand down and leave the country. We also helped out with setting up their assessment app as they wanted to move away from filling this all in on paper, and then also the data gathering that came from that app. And we also set up a rapid response team. So the municipality was getting quite a few calls from members of the public that were concerned about certain buildings that they saw as potentially about to fall down, and that needed a quick response to go and assess them. So we set up a rapid response team that stayed within the municipality, and the municipality could come and kind of grab us, and we'd go out with their local engineers and quickly assess the buildings with them and help them set up any cordons that needed to happen. So we were in country until our last day on the 12th of August. We did handovers and workshops, which I'll touch on later. And then on the 13th of August, we fly home and stand down. So as Mark and Josh have mentioned, a large part of what we did out there was coordination of international assessors. We have all these skilled engineers from search and rescue teams, and we need to make sure that they are utilised in an effective way and help the local engineers that are there. So this involves a few steps. First of all, sectorisation of the city. This is essentially where we divide the city up into portions, and it means that we can send teams out to these portions, and separate teams don't overlap with each other as they have outlines of the areas they're looking at. So it really just helps with logistics. As Mark mentioned, this is all based on boundaries, administrative boundaries within the city, but often those are too big, so you do want to subdivide those down so they become more manageable for a team to tackle. And this is a process very much done with the Lebanese authorities, as they're the ones with the knowledge of their own city, so it's important that it works for them. In a practicality point of view, on the left you can see the sorts of maps of the administrative boundaries of the city. We quite literally were printing off maps and highlighting them up and sticking them on the walls, and it just gave a really good visual representation of what's going on in the city. As in the right picture, you can see we use sticky notes to tell us which teams were in what areas, and that was kind of the practicalities of how it works on the ground. A list of available Lebanese assessors is obviously vital. The Lebanese authorities very much oversaw the coordination of their own assessors. We just plugged in the international engineers where they were available. So obviously a list of available international engineers is required. And this is changing every day. These international engineers do have other commitments. That they've come with a USAR team. And also these USAR teams are, over the days that we were there, were generally demobilising due to the primary function of USAR being over. So we just had to adapt to what resource we had each day. And briefings were vitally important. So we held briefings with international engineers pretty much on a daily basis. As we were updating procedure, we had to brief the international teams of this and any changes to the forms or protocols that were now in place. So the Lebanese engineers were also getting briefed on this, but that came through their own authorities. And then lastly, assigning international engineers to assist the Lebanese engineers, which was quite a big logistical task for us. We did try to match the same teams up with the same local assessors each day, as naturally you build up a rapport with people through working together. But it was also important to make sure that as sectors were getting complete, we were moving the resource to where it's needed. So this was also kind of an ever-changing picture. The next, obviously, large thing that we did was technical building assessments. So Mark has kind of already talked about how we developed the Lebanese assessment form. And then as part of that, SARAID engineers, including myself, we went out with local engineers each day. And this was really key for us to understand the assessment procedure that was already in place and for us to be able to comment on what could possibly be tweaked or improved upon. I just want to run through some examples that we came across to give you an idea of the sorts of buildings we were looking at and the process that's involved. So the aim of the inspections is essentially to determine if the building is habitable or needs to be evacuated. So at this level of assessment, we're not trying to work out the exact faults of the building or how they could be rectified. This kind of in-depth level of assessment happens at a later date. At this point, we just want to quickly assess if the building is safe for someone to move back into or not. So In this procedure, we recommend it starts with examining the entire of the outside of the structure, so kind of doing a 360 walk around. And I think this example shows the importance of this. Hopefully you can see from this picture, it's a high-rise structure, it appears relatively okay, limited to facade damage. However, once you walk around to the other side, which was facing the blast, all the windows were blown out, which really made it needing evacuation. I unfortunately couldn't find the pictures I have of the other side, so these are two different buildings, but I just wanted to give you an idea of the sort of facade and glass damage that we were seeing. You know, it's quite typical for buildings in Beirut to have floor to ceiling of glass, and a lot of this was blown out, hence needs evacuation. And that's not to say that there's structural damage or it needs to be demolished, it's purely to say that at that point in time, it's unsafe for someone to inhabit. And in this case, it was actually the case that the structure was perfectly fine. And we often found this to be the case in Beirut. There were some really good concrete buildings. They have lots of codes in place. These codes have seismic design involved. And it meant that a lot of buildings might have appeared quite damaged. There was a lot of facade damage, but the structure itself fared quite well. Another example we came across, we actually got sent to this building as part of our rapid response team. In the left picture, towards the top, just below the glass, you can see that part of the parapet has been blown out, and then the other kind of two sections look as if they're about to fall out. The right picture is just a picture from the inside. So for us, there's a few concerns here. Obviously, if that parapet fails, it appears to be supporting the facade above, which in turn is supporting the roof. So if that parapet fails, that you've got a risk of the roof falling into the room below, but you've also got a risk to the streets, to the streets around this building. So it ended up that the streets were all cordoned off and evacuated, and the building was as well. Just one last example. So this is an older building that was perhaps built before before codes were in effect. As you can see, there's a lot of roof damage where the blast has blown the roof out, and this is very typical with blast damage, as the blast pushes up on the roof, which is obviously in the opposite direction it's been designed for. And as much as you wouldn't class this as completely collapsed, maybe it's partially collapsed, it's clearly no part of it is safe to be habitable. So data management has been touched on. The Lebanese took control of their own data management, which is really important, and it needs to be this way, as when we leave, they need to still have an understanding of the data that they have back from their assessors. So from a DAC point of view, and the data we were managing, this was coming in from the international engineers. We collated information that came in each day, recorded it, and it allowed us to kind of start building up a picture of what's going on the ground. So the overall picture, this is a Google Maps view, and it just shows the sectorization that we did. We mainly worked in these two areas of the city, which were right next to the blast. They were the most damaged, and this just shows you which teams went out where. So in total, we had 10 international teams out, and they assessed over 500 buildings in the 3 days that we have data for. So as this data came in, these are sorts of the graphs that we were able to produce. The one on the left, as you can see, as the days go on, the amount of red and yellow buildings that we were coming across was decreasing. And this is quite typical for this situation, as you are typically going to the worst case areas first to do those assessments and moving out to buildings that were less affected. And then on the right, you can see the sectors beginning with M, which was Medawar, which is right next to the blast, have a much higher proportion of red and yellow buildings. And again, of course, it's right next to the blast compared to the sectors further out. So unfortunately, we did have to leave and head back. So we did quite an extensive handover procedure with the Lebanese authorities, and this came in a number of formats. So obviously over the days that we were there, we were agreeing content for a guidance note, which we put together for them. So that's the proposal for Lebanese-led damage assessment coordination in Beirut. This just compiled everything that we'd discussed with them and agreed with them over the past few days. So changes to the form and the kind of placards that we suggested to them. We also did some capacity building workshops to the municipality assessors on this assessment procedure that we'd agreed. We did a sectorization workshop with the military as a bit of capacity building there. And then lastly, we had a rota deployment report, which included data from the international engineers. And this went out to international organisations such as the British Embassy in SARAID, UN. So we were compiling all of this whilst in Lebanon, as we wanted to make sure that on the day that we left, everything was in place and we'd handed over and we'd given them this guidance note before, we're actually on a flight. So I guess what's the future? Well, in Beirut, they are continuing with assessments. This is a long procedure. After the quick assessments are done, you go into more detailed assessments. So they can figure out exactly which buildings are unfixable and which ones need some remedial work. They have also asked us for some more workshops. So we are currently in discussions with them to provide some further training, and we hope to be able to do this once the global situation allows, and we have a bit of a brief defined with them. And then as a DAC concept, this is being developed. SARAID is looking into setting up the principles of a DAC for our own standard operating procedures. And then our team leader today is actually at the Beirut After Action Review, which is a 2-day virtual workshop held by the UN out of Geneva. And it's all about giving feedback on the disaster response. And part of this is giving feedback on the DAC and to help start developing it as a concept. So yes, that's all from me. I guess any questions?
I'm not actually sure how to work on how people can raise them.
So we've got 3 questions. Nikos, can you hear me? Or if not, it's no problem. I can read the questions, Josh, and then we can work out who wants to respond to them. The first one is, how much does a deployment cost SARAID, and who pays for this?
Sure. So should we do one question at a time, or what were the other questions?
I can.
Let's go through one at a time.
Okay. Well, on the deployment costs, for Beirut, I couldn't say, but for a few, and I don't know if Mark and Suzie, if you know the answer, the number for Beirut, but for full USAR deployments.
For Beirut, it was about 10 grand.
Okay, yeah, so 10 grand, but that would be generally quite a bit less than a full USAR deployment, because a full USAR deployment would involve carrying a lot more equipment, a ton and a half of equipment on commercial flights. So I think for Nepal we were north of 20k. That could be more than that. And the where the money comes from, it's all completely 100% from donations. So we work with a number of companies, or we would like to work with a number of companies that may be interested in sponsorship. We also receive equipment from various sponsors, such as Makita provide our tools, and we also just do charity events and so on as well. But this is one of the key areas that SARAID as an organisation that we have to really focus on, because we want to remain able to respond to these disasters whenever they occur.
Yeah, that's right. Some of the USAR deployments are certainly north of 20,000. Sometimes we get reduced cost flights from airlines, but typically our deployment base level cost that we like to ensure that we have in the kitty as such, but to make us still deployable, is between 20 and 25,000 pounds. So you can see it's not an insignificant amount. And being an NGO, we get no government funding. So as Josh mentioned, it is all down to generous donations and fundraising that the team does throughout the year, as well as the training. So we've got another question now. I'll come back to the second one, Josh, because that's mainly regarding to the EFIT upcoming mission. So I'll come back to that one. But the next one was, how are response teams assembled? Are the engineers typically working in industry or are they in academia? If they're working, how does it work with their employer and current projects? And I can start with that one. The response teams for SARAID is due to, if you're a member of SARAID, you will have gone through a rigorous training program. For USAR deployment, that's between 18 and 24 months. For engineer specific only, if you're not interested in being a technician, that could be reduced. But typically all our engineers are trained as urban search and rescue engineer technicians as well, so capable of doing both. It gives them a good understanding and it bonds the team better. Everybody's in a similar situation, just with different skill sets. They are typically working in industry, the engineers, almost entirely in industry that I'm aware of now. And it will vary from company to company. Companies are typically very good in supporting all of our engineers. As I'm aware, I know Robert Berg Group, Elliott Wood, Atkins, the company I work for, have all been very supportive in combination of sort of providing some paid leave, allowance at short notice. And it's a case of speaking to your company if you're interested to understand what they may be able to provide. And what I didn't mention that much in detail in the actual presentation was the specialist support network that we're exploring at this stage. And for this instance, certainly given many of our engineers are with reputable companies and have access to a wide range of technical experts, there is a certain reach back capacity for the engineers and utilised for specialist circumstances, whether it be a particular building or structure or a bridge. Then we have that capacity to reach back to our companies, and we're looking at formalising that now in what we're going to term a specialist support network. And so you wouldn't necessarily have to go through all the training, but if you were interested in providing your engineering expertise in the event of a disaster, then you could be signed up to this register with your specific expertise and called upon in such an event. Josh, Suzie, anything to add on that one, or should we move on to another?
No, just to summarise, there's basically two ways as an engineer to get involved, and that is to join the team, go through the training up to 2 years, or join this specialist support network and be available to provide remote assistance during deployments.
Perfect. Thank you. We've got a comment here from Colin Morrison. As a blast engineer, glass can blow outwards, particularly on the sides and rear of the building, so 360-degree walk around is critical. Yep, thanks for that. Really useful, and I think Suzie and the team, it's one of our standard operating procedures regardless of the event, but in particular for an engineering assessment, vital here, as Colin, you mentioned. Thank you. I've got another one coming in from Carlos Alberto. What kind of tools do you use for data collection and reporting? Suzie, do you want to take this one from on the ground in Beirut and what was used out there?
Yeah. Sure. So the Lebanese assessors had, it started off as paper forms that they were filling in and would hand back at the end of the day, and that would get collated. That actually changed whilst we were out there to an app. I don't know enough about apps to give you much more information than that, but from our point of view, we, from an international assessor's point of view, we gave them exactly what we wanted, and gave them what we wanted them to track, and then they quite literally emailed it to us at the end of the day, and we collated it on Excel. Nothing, I'm sure we could do something fancier, but it needs to be something, because of the situation, it needs to be something that's quick and that's accessible for lots of people to be able to pick up, and it worked for what we needed.
Can I just add in briefly, just to highlight that the tools for data collection and management have to be have to be led by the host nation. It has to be owned by the host nation. So for search and rescue, there's various tools that different teams use. And in Albania, for example, many of the teams were proposing their own tools for data collection to the Albanian authorities. But really, what's important is that whatever system they use, they fully own for the long-term duration, and it really needs to be developed by them. So there was one municipality, Tirana municipality in Albania, that was just using Google Forms. It's fine. Durrës, they were using paper, but then UNDP proposed an assessment form, or rather an app, which we worked very closely with them to transfer all of the structural assessment information on the paper forms into this mobile app, and that was taken on by an Albanian company. So, with the data collection, as also with the method of technical assessment and the method of coordination, it all has to be really, really assessor, host nation led, which is why it's not necessarily a one size fits all for all countries. It depends on what that country is comfortable and happy to do.
Very true. Thanks, Josh. Next one we've got from Terry Webb. Thank you for the presentations, Josh and Suzie. Can you explain the importance of technical experts working in pairs, therefore not alone, in order to support each other in difficult decision-making assessments? And yeah, as I say, that is vitally important, not just for the international teams, but all of the local assessors typically were in pairs also. As was touched on in sometimes with the forms that are developed, there can be an ambiguity that you'd get 5 engineers looking at a building with the same assessment form, and they would all potentially interpret it differently if done blindly or if done without any conversation. And so it's something that's been implemented in every disaster we all have, I think, responded to, the importance to have pairs and to have an active discussion, and not just enforce your initial thoughts onto the local assessors, but to have an open, honest discussion about the technical issues. And I think, Josh or Suzie, any thoughts on that from yourselves?
Yeah, I can give an example from Albania. So it's a really good point that Terry raises, that technical assessment is it's a subjective process that's based on the expertise and the viewpoint of the assessor, right? So it is very, very important to get more than one opinion. And the example from Albania is that in September, the first event of the 2 in Albania, where it was less of a severe event, and we were able to assess and make proposals to their damage assessment system, we worked very closely with the authorities to propose improvements to their own existing assessment methods, just plugging the gaps with international guidance. And then we held a workshop where we had north of 30 Albanian engineers on site for a particular building and going through an assessment. And I mean, if you can imagine 30 engineers all looking at the same damaged building, you had 30 different opinions, right? And where the key learning point there was that it really became apparent the value of improving the actual assessment method and the form and the documentation of how to make the decision process, because everybody had a different opinion. We then sat down, went through the facts of what we'd seen against the procedure we were to follow, as in if we see this, then it implies this. If we see this, it implies this. And then at the end, we had near agreement between the 30 engineers of, okay, this actually categorizes as damaged state 4 because of these reasons. So you definitely need more than one pair of eyes looking on the building, and you also need to have a very clearly documented and consistent method of damage assessment, so that those different assessors can look at can make their assessment according to the exact same criteria.
Okay, brilliant. Thanks, Josh. The next one comes in. Do you also participate in detailed damage assessment, such as damage assessment in specific typology of building structures, etc.? Also, many of the photos show RC structures. Any comments on masonry structures, please? As a first pass, typically the stage of the response hasn't reached the detailed damage assessments as yet. Previous ones in Ecuador, actually, though, for some of the structures, it was apparent that we did need to move immediately from a rapid assessment to a detailed because of the priority of the building. And I'm sure Josh can lend some examples after, as in Nepal as well, where critical infrastructure such as hospitals and things like that need to be put back into working order as soon as possible. So it might move straight to a detailed assessment. So it does happen on certain deployments. And in terms of the specific building typology and structures, it will be dependent on the disaster and those most affected of the host country. And so masonry structures, yes, the assessments are made of those as well. In Beirut, you're correct in saying that most of them were RC structures, and therefore not that. But we have done a number in remote places, whether it be Ecuador, Nepal, local typologies have been assessed as well. Josh, Suzie, anything to add on that one?
Suzie, do you want to go?
No, not for myself.
I was looking for a slide after this one, but yeah, you touched on a really important point, which is these stages of damage assessment. I don't know if you can see that it's top right-hand image, the bottom of the two figures in the top right-hand image, and you've got different countries will do it in different ways, and it's always entirely important to follow the local procedures. The ATC procedure would be multi-stage, whereby you have your rapid visual screening, your rapid assessment, your detailed assessment, and your engineering assessment, and that's a really important point, because that's one of the key things that needs to be agreed in that procedural legal framework component with the host nation. That there are these different stages, and exactly what stage each assessment is in, because it's a really clear and common confusion, whereby imagine the situation: your home, the place where you live, has had an explosion or an earthquake. You're an engineer. You're told to go out and assess, and you might not have that much more information than that, and so it's not clear whether or not you should be running down the street taking a number of how many buildings you think are damaged, or you should spend an hour on one building. And that's where it's very important to clearly clarify the different stages and what stage you're in. And yeah, as was said, we're generally going to be operating in that rapid assessment stage. So with the assumption that the rapid visual screening has been done, so you have a rough idea of where the high priority areas are and the rough numbers. And then you're doing that rapid assessment to try and figure out life safety decisions, evacuate, don't evacuate. And then the detailed assessment, in terms of returning to buildings for a detailed assessment, that would generally be outside of our time frame. But if you have, as Mark said, critical infrastructure, hospitals and schools, etc., then that's when you would have a more detailed assessment. And that's exactly what happened in Nepal and in Hurricane Irma as well.
Okay, thanks, Josh. Just the last two for people still listening. One from Stephen Kelly. Can you define an engineer? Is a specific background a requirement to be considered? Depending on what you are volunteering for, Stephen, if you're interested in becoming a USAR technician, any background is welcomed. We've got a great diverse team, not just of engineers. We've got emergency responders, paramedics, fire, police. We've got all different backgrounds, and that's one of the great things about SARAID, is that everyone brings their own skill set, and what helps us blend and work well as a team. So I'd actively encourage you to join from that point of view. From an engineer, most of the engineers that we have are civil structural backgrounds, and in terms of the training that they go through in a USAR environment, then a lot of the work relating to that is training, to be honest, whether it be in cribbing, in shoring, and so a lot can be taught with a basic understanding of engineering. So I'd certainly say don't let that be a barrier. Actively encourage anyone to find out more and get involved in any way they can.
The only thing I'd add to that is that we do not necessarily require subject-specific expertise. So we don't expect the engineers to have, seismic design experience or etc., because we do actually go through a lot of examples in our standard training, and then for our engineers as well, we do supplement with additional training specific to collapse patterns, building typologies, different types of hazard, etc. And the stage of an engineer's career as well is perhaps less important in whether they can become a member. If you're a graduate member, or if you're a chartered member, or if you're retired, all are welcome. But though obviously the level of experience will dictate your level of responsibility on site and on deployment.
Great, thanks, Josh. And I think this last one is for you, mainly relating to the EFIT mission. So it's from Maria Contore. So I don't know if you want to take it offline, but I'll read it to you anyway. Regarding your upcoming mission in Izmir and Samos, what is the procedure you will be following to assess remotely the level of damage in the areas struck by the earthquake tsunami?
Okay, yeah, I guess it probably is better to email me and we can chat about it offline, because it's a bit off topic. But just to very briefly explain to the other people listening, EFID is the Earthquake Engineering Field Investigation Team, and they respond to disasters, sending built environment professionals to learn the key lessons of what happened and disseminate those lessons to the engineering profession. And in this case, for the recent earthquake on Friday in the Aegean Sea affecting Izmir and other towns in Turkey and the island of Samos in Greece, then it's not feasible for the team to actually go in person because of lockdown, because of travel restrictions. So we'll be using various remote tools, including collection of data via social media, collection of data via other resources, local partners that are carrying out local damage assessments we'll be working closely with. We'll be collecting data, drone footage, etc., where it's available, and these kind of tools. So it's separate to what SARAID is doing, but obviously it's very intertwined, and it's a good example of the different ways that engineers can get involved in the immediate response through SARAID, and in other ways as well. And we'd always encourage you to build those skills however you can. And hopefully come and speak to SARAID and EFIT when you feel that you have you're able to contribute.
Perfect. Thanks, Josh. And I think that's all the questions. So over to you, Valentina and Nikos, just to close.
Nikos, will you take over on the London Young Members Group, or I think I should be taking the lead? Can you see the slides?
Yes, we can see the slides.
Okay, so before concluding, I want to remind you that this evening meeting was a joint, organized jointly with the London Young Members Group, the EFIT group, and the SARAID group. So just few words for me to introduce you to the London Young Members Group and what they do. Kirsten, can you please tell me whether you see the slides?
Yes, it's moved across.
Yeah, okay. Because I cannot really move the slides from one to the next.
I can move them across for you if you just tell me to click next slide.
Okay, so I think if you jump to slide 50, which is the first slide of the London Young Members Group, that's where we are, I think. Is what you see?
We can see the young members, what we do, who we are.
Okay.
Slide.
Okay, so the ISTRAC London Young Members Group obviously is a group that represents fresh graduates and young professionals. They do organize technical and social events, arrange site visit and outreach opportunities. They run concept design workshop series and obviously also lunch competitions. Please move to the next slide. How to get in touch. There is a free registration on website, so you can click the link or email the chair at the following email address, and obviously follow the group on LinkedIn, Instagram, and Twitter. And in terms of events coming up, the next slide, there is a second photo competition. Entries via social media are allowed until the 22nd of November 2020. So please share your best picture, and to learn more, just visit the webpage to know the entry details. Regarding SARAID, if you please move to the next slide. As I said, this evening meeting was a joint meeting with other two groups. One of them is SARAID. As I said, Mark belongs to the SARAID group. Again, if you want to get in touch, please visit the website. We also have a young members group. So email your interest at the email address that you can see on the slide. We also have a logo competition to give SARAID and the young SARAID a new logo. The entry was originally until the 31st of October, but it has been extended until the 7th of November. So please feel free to visit the website, check the entry requirements, and submit your ideas. Also, follow the next slide, please. Follow us on social media. We have a Facebook page, a LinkedIn page, and a Twitter page as well. And attend our meetings. The next evening lecture will be is scheduled for the 25th of November 2020, and the title is Don't Look Up, Look Down, Kathmandu, UNESCO, Archaeology and Learning from the 2015 Gorkha Earthquakes, and it will be delivered by Professor Robin Cunningham. And finally, move to the next slide, please. Few words on the earthquake engineering field investigation team. As I mentioned at the beginning, Josh is the acting chair of the group, and as you may or may not know, we are also going to deploy remotely for the next mission to Izmir due to the latest earthquake event. If you want to know more about, please visit the website or get in contact with Alan Brereton to first become a member and then be part of what we do and the missions that we organize. And with that, I would like to thank you very much, the speakers. Your contribution was very, very interesting. And also thank the attendees for the very interesting questions. And wish you a nice rest of the evening. And that's all for me. Thank you very much.